So I'm going to focus on the vaccine. I think that's kind of the million-dollar question right now. If I don't know if anybody has already had it, but hopefully most of us on this call will get it relatively soon. And my disclaimer is I'm just a lousy urologist, and I'm not an immunologist or a vaccine expert. A lot of the things I'm going to talk about, though I certainly understand as an MD, um, and I think it's important just to recognize a lot of things you hear in the news. It seems to change over time, and that's just because a lot of it's based on consensus. And as the evidence arises, the recommendations change. If you think of the eternal saga about wearing masks and not wearing masks, et cetera, it seems to change every few months. But that's just as the evidence evolves. So just a bit of a reminder, COVID-19 is actually the illness, the coronavirus infectious illness. The virus is SARS-CoV-2, and I'm probably going to use those names interchangeably throughout, so don't hold me to it. So I'm going to give a little bit of background about the vaccines. Some of it's just scientific interest. I think it's interest to general public and certainly to you. And then we'll talk a little bit more in detail about the vaccine and BCG, where there's really very little guidance on what to do, but I think we can piece together what we should do. And we have recently put together a statement for Bladder Cancer Canada. And then at the end, we'll just touch on systemic therapy, so chemotherapy, immunotherapy, et cetera, where I think there is a little bit more guidance because that's more common. That's not specific to bladder cancer. That's a more general issue. And of course, a talk on COVID wouldn't be complete without saying that these are actually the most important things. Is the social distancing measures are still the key, and they will be with us presumably for the rest of this calendar year. Even if we're all vaccinated, we're probably going to be doing this for a while. So don't let up. So let's talk a little bit about the COVID-19 vaccines. So these are the three that are in the news the most. And the reason I put journal publications here is to show you that there actually is really good evidence to support the use of all three of these. So the top one on the left is the Pfizer vaccine or BioNTech. BioNTech is kind of funny. Some of you will know that I went to medical school in Germany in the city of Mainz. My wife is from Mainz, and BioNTech is a small company from the city of Mainz. The headquarters is across the street from the hospital where one of my children was born. The middle one is the Moderna vaccine. And so those two are both RNA vaccines. Those are the ones that are available in Canada and the one we hear about the most. And they're actually remarkably effective, right? So 95, 94, 95% efficacy of a virus is almost unheard of. And certainly you wouldn't expect it right out of the gate with new technology in such a rapidly developed vaccine. So we can be really happy that we have such effective vaccines. And then the third one on the bottom right is the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is not available to us in Canada, but it's in the news a lot nonetheless. And a couple of things I wanted to highlight about it just to sort of compare and contrast. So this is the Moderna vaccine, just to show you a little bit of the evidence to convince you that there is good evidence. You can see this was the big trial that was done, and patients received either 2 doses of the RNA vaccine, which is this orange circle, or placebo. So they did get an injection, just there was nothing in it, and it was 28 days apart. And you can see that there certainly are side effects with the vaccine. So some sort of injection site reaction was experienced in most patients, 84%, even some who got the placebo. And then systemic adverse events are things like headache or muscle pain or something beyond just the injection site. And that was also fairly common. So, and this isn't surprising if you stick RNA into a person. So RNA, the body recognizes RNA as an intruding virus, and it actually causes quite an inflammatory reaction. The immune system is trained to pick up RNA and try and get rid of it. So the side effects are simply due to that. It's a response to what's being injected, and otherwise it's actually remarkably safe, and there's really no concern about any hidden long-term toxicity. It's only RNA, and it's rapidly degraded. And then you see the efficacy, and what you see here is the risk of COVID-19 infection, usually a symptomatic infection confirmed by a test over approximately, I guess this is 4 months after injection. And you can see, so there's first injection on day 1 or 0, I guess, and the second injection on day 28. You see the curves are already separating well before the second injection. So you're already getting some protection. We generally say protection starts at about 14 days because that's when you have good antibody production against what was immunized. And the curve remains remarkably flat for the vaccinated patients or people. Very low rate of COVID-19 versus those who got placebo. They actually had a much higher rate of infection. And you can see here per 1,000 person years, it's 80 versus 6. So a dramatic difference. It really works. The 95% is comparing these numbers here. And more numbers below, actually 94%. So if you look at the Pfizer vaccine, they didn't put together quite the same illustration for me to use, but another big trial, 43,000 patients, all adults. They were vaccinated day 0 and day 21, and also looked at safety, and the safety was very similar to the last one. And then you see here again that after somewhere 10 to 14 days, you have this great protection where the curve remains completely flat with the vaccine, while patients on placebo are getting COVID-19 at a fairly significant rate. And again, 95% efficacy, which is really remarkable. So these are RNA vaccines. RNA vaccines are actually something new. They've been, the idea has been there for a long time, but they've never been realized as they have in these cases. They've been tried for other things in the past, but have never gotten to the point that they're actually rolled out for patients. And basically what it is the important part about the virus that the immune system recognizes are these spike proteins that stick up from the surface. And so you can easily imagine that they have a very characteristic surface that antibodies and cells of the immune system react with. And the vaccine is basically the RNA that codes for the spike protein. And it's very easy to create RNA in the lab. I mean, for doing research, you just order whatever RNA sequence whenever you want. It's super easy to do that. What's special about the vaccine is that they've altered some of the bases in the RNA so that it's actually more tolerable to the patient. As I told you, RNA is actually causes quite an inflammatory response when it's injected. So they've made it more tolerable, and they've packaged it in these little droplets of fat, the nanoparticles, lipid nanoparticles, that will allow it to get where it needs to go. If you just put naked RNA in, it would be degraded immediately. RNA is easily degraded, and that's why these have to be cold too. That's why they're preserved at minus 80 degrees, because otherwise it degrades very easily. But anyway, you put the RNA in the lipid nanoparticle, you inject it in the patient, it gets into the cells, and the cells read this RNA to make spike protein. It does not integrate into the DNA in any way. It doesn't alter the DNA of the cells, which can cause, theoretically can cause changes in DNA sequence and other problems. This is just being read in the cell and converted into spike protein. It can't make a virus, it can't infect anybody, but it is turned into the spike protein, which the immune system then recognizes and develops a memory response for. And so in the top right, you see it's very easy to produce, and that's why they're able to go from new discovery to mass distribution very quickly. It's very safe, and this is particularly important in patients having a weakened immune system or cancer patients or whatever treatment you might be getting, the RNA by itself is not going to cause any harm. It's not going to infect anybody. And we'll come back to the point that, if anything, it's just not going to work if your immune system is suppressed, because you're not going to react to it, but it's not going to cause any harm. And then, as I said, since it's so easily degraded, that's why we always hear about how it has to be kept at -80 or -20 degrees. This is just another nicer diagram of the RNA in this fat globule that gets into the cell, and it goes through the cell machinery to spit out the protein on the cell surface that the immune system recognizes. Now, the AstraZeneca vaccine is quite different, and this is more of what we think of, I think, our classic vaccines being. There are, of course, all sorts of different vaccines, but this is an adenovirus. So this is a common virus that could cause a cold or something similar, like coronavirus, but a little bit different. It's actually a chimpanzee adenovirus that has been modified so it cannot cause disease. It cannot actually replicate itself and go from cell to cell. It can get into cells, but it's not going to replicate itself. And in this viral vector, they have put in the sequence for the spike protein again. And this is now DNA sequence. So we now have the DNA being put into a virus, which is put into the patient, and the virus will get into cells and tell those cells to make the spike protein, but it cannot replicate and go and infect other cells. It's just in the cell it arrives at. And when the cell makes a spike protein, of course, the immune system recognizes that and develops memory cells. So the end effect is the same. But it's quite a different mechanism. The efficacy, this is the Lancet paper. So Lancet is sort of the English equivalent of New England Journal. New England Journal is the big US journal. And this was developed at Oxford, so the AstraZeneca or Oxford vaccine. And you can see that the curves, again, are widely separated. So the red is the vaccine, the adenovirus vaccine. The blue actually is a derivative of a meningitis vaccine, which of course does not protect against COVID-19. You can see that the red line is not quite as flat. In either case, this is where they do the usual 2 doses with a period in between, versus here, this is actually where patients only got a single dose. You see there's still pretty good separation just with a single dose. But this is quoted as having approximately 65-70% efficacy because the curves are not quite as wide apart as the other curves. But this is still considered very good if you compare it to other vaccines like the flu vaccine, which would have a similar efficacy, and that's what we get every year. And of course, this one's much easier to store and transport and disseminate around the world. It doesn't have to be at -80. And the idea with all of these, of course, is that you develop antibodies on the one hand that will recognize virus if the virus comes into your body, or also cells, so specific T cells that recognize virus if virus were to enter your body. This is the point of a vaccination. And of course, it's all dependent on the cells or the antibodies recognizing the spike proteins. And what we're seeing now with the variants is that we're seeing different COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 viruses coming out with alterations in the spike proteins. So the DNA sequence is actually different. If you look at the bottom here, this is the UK variant, this B117, and each of these funny letters and marks here is a mutation. There are multiple mutations in the UK variant. And what's most important are all these, I lost my cursor, all these mutations within the sequence that codes for the spike protein, which makes the spike protein a little bit different and that can, on the one hand, affect how efficiently it can get into cells. So those spike proteins bind to cells, mostly in your respiratory tract, and then have to get in and replicate and infect other cells. And so they can do that more efficiently, is one thing. And then the other thing is that the antibodies and the immune cells that target this after vaccination cannot latch on as well. So they don't, the small variations mean that the vaccination might not, we don't know very well, but it might not work as well. And it's very similar with the South Africa variant, so the B1351, which has a lot of the same types of alterations. And so there's three big questions with the variants: is do they transmit more rapidly, more effectively? And I think the indication is that they do, and it's sort of a evolutionary sort of survival of the fittest thing, that if one strain spreads faster than another strain, it will take over. And that's what we've seen in the UK. In a matter of months, this UK strain took over, meaning that it's somehow more effective in going from patient to patient, more efficient. And then big question is infection more severe? And the initial thinking was probably not. There might be more severe infections and more deaths from COVID just because there are more cases. And just this week, there's been some news that maybe it is more severe, but I think we don't really know that. And then the effectiveness of the vaccination with the variants, I think, is also a little bit up in the air. We did hear in the news that the AstraZeneca vaccine, the Oxford vaccine, might not work against the South Africa variant. And their study was, their one big study was done at a time where they could actually measure this, whereas for the other two, the variants weren't around, so they weren't really captured. And in the AstraZeneca study, it was a lot of very young patients, so there weren't very many severe cases of COVID-19. And so we don't know if the vaccine actually protects against severe cases. It appears not to protect against mild cases. So we'll have to stay tuned and as we gather more information on those variants. So what's going to happen when we're all vaccinated? Initially, not much. We're still going to have to do all these good things, because the one thing that we don't know is whether people who are vaccinated can still transmit the virus or not. So if you are one of, let's say, 10 or 6 people in the community who are vaccinated, then it's still very easy for you to, potentially easy for you to carry the virus from one person to the next. And the way it is right now, there's still a lot of virus in the community, so it wouldn't be that unlikely that you would actually do that if you weren't being careful. So that's why the recommendations for now will still remain that you have to be careful, you have to do social distancing, avoid crowds, wear a mask, so that you're not transmitting. And when we reach a point where we have a very high rate of vaccination, we have a very low rate of infection in the community, and hopefully we know a little bit more about how vaccinated people transmit the virus, then we can relax some of these rules. And of course, with the variants coming along, you worry that the vaccine will then stop working as variants come along, but this will probably turn into something like the flu, where we have a different vaccine every year. And so the vaccine makers are already working on the next upgraded vaccine for next year, for the fall. So let's get a little bit into the vaccine and BCG. I think the concerns in general are, in general for cancer care, not specific to BCG. The first question is the vaccine safe in patients who are receiving cancer therapy, whether it be radiation, surgery, chemotherapy, whatever it might be? And then secondly, does the cancer therapy actually impair the effectiveness of the vaccine or the cancer itself? And those, of course, are two quite different questions. You'll remember what BCG is. It is live bacteria, mycobacterium. So it's related to tuberculosis from the cow, bovine tuberculosis. It was grown at the time, the beginning of the 1900s, over 13 years in the lab until it lost sort of its nasty features that made it cause disease. And so we refer to it as live attenuated. It can get into the system and cause an immune response, but it doesn't actually make people sick. And it has been used for more than 100 years as a vaccine against tuberculosis. So it's injected under the skin in neonates and infants to protect against tuberculosis in many parts of the world, not Canada. And so BCG is a vaccine, and if we look for guidance on how to deliver vaccines together with the COVID-19 vaccine, we do have this national recommendation. So the National Advisory Committee on Immunization has a very generic recommendation on how to or when to give other vaccines if a patient needs a COVID-19 vaccine. And the general recommendation is that you should get no other vaccine within 14 days before a COVID-19 dose or 28 days after. And if you're giving these 21 to 28 days apart, it really means that you get nothing from 14 days before the first to 28 days after the last. And if you think of BCG, intravesical BCG, as being like a vaccine, this is a big gap. This is 2.5 months where a patient would not be able to get BCG. And in most cases, that's not really reasonable. It's reasonable to make a recommendation like this if you're thinking about vaccinating a person against another illness that can easily wait 2.5 months. But if you're giving a cancer therapy, I think the ability to just delay and wait is less, and it's not really acceptable. And it's probably not necessary is the other thing. So we spent some time looking for guidance on how to administer the vaccine in patients receiving intravesical BCG, and this is exactly what we found. And there's no animation on this slide. There's nothing there. So we did find this document. This came out just in January 22nd of this year. For those of us on the line in BC, this is our guiding document on COVID vaccine and patients with cancer. But unfortunately, not a word of BCG. So it was not considered. It's all about systemic therapy, but nothing in our domain. So we developed our own, myself with Wes Kassouf at McGill and Girish Kulkarni in UHN Toronto, who think we know a thing or two about BCG. And we got some input from various immunologists at the 3 institutions, including one here in BC, who's a member of the National Advisory Committee on Immunization. They had different perspectives. They're not really thinking about BCG every day, but they certainly are thinking about immunizations, and little tidbits of information from one or the other. We did ask the authors of the BC Cancer Guidance document, and they said, yeah, that's a good question. Let us know what you come up with. So it wasn't that helpful. And then we came up with a recommendation that's really based on what we know about the immune response to BCG and the immune response to the vaccine. So what do we know about vaccines? We know very well, one thing that's well established is that antibody production takes about 14 days. And that's where the waiting 2 weeks thing comes from. Ideally, you want to give the COVID-19 vaccine 14 days to take effect and provide protection. However, there's no real evidence that giving BCG is going to disrupt that in any way. So if a patient needs BCG for their bladder cancer, you don't necessarily want to wait for 14 days. I think potentially more important is that we know also if you give an RNA vaccine, which two of the 2 ones available in Canada are, that you see a drop in the white blood cells that can fight infection, the lymphocytes. and that these recover again after about a week. And this, again, we don't know if that actually is relevant to BCG, either safety or efficacy, but it would make sense to wait that week if we can. So we have maybe 2 weeks in the ideal case, 1 week, makes sense in somebody where we really want to get treatment too. But what do we know about BCG? And BCG is an immune stimulant, right? So we don't think BCG is going to interfere with anything. It's going to stimulate a response. And there are several trials out there that show that vaccines such as influenza vaccine are more effective after intradermal vaccine with BCG. There's also very good evidence that upper respiratory tract infections are less common and less severe after BCG vaccination. But this is actual vaccination in the skin and not putting it in the bladder. We don't really know if there's a difference, but the immunologists we talked to seem to think that there probably is. Any of you who've had BCG, it causes quite a reaction. So I think that you're getting the full vaccine several times over. One very interesting study that was published just last year, and so in October in Cell, which is another very high tier journal. This was a relatively small study. You see the numbers over in this curve here, 78 placebo arm, 72 BCG, so small trial. But what they did, they took elderly patients who were at risk for just general viral infections, and they were blinded, so neither the physician or study nurse nor the patient knew what they were getting, and they either got intradermal BCG or placebo, and then they're monitored for any infection. They did some other translational stuff in the lab as well, which I've cut off the figure here, but what they found is that there were fewer viral infections in general and fewer respiratory infections. They didn't look specifically at COVID-19. This was very early on. They just looked at these general infections. And you can see here that it's almost a 50% reduction in risk of viral infections in patients after a single dose of BCG into the skin. So we think that BCG is actually beneficial. So we're not worried about what's going to happen to the vaccine after BCG. This is something that I'm sure most of you have heard about, the idea that if you look at population level, countries who currently have a BCG vaccination policy have fewer deaths from COVID than countries that don't, including countries like Canada. And some of the ones that have been in the news a lot, Italy, Spain, UK, never have or have had BCG vaccination programs that have interrupted. And there's a lot, there's a lot of evidence around this that suggests that a population-wide vaccination program protects against BCG, although it's circumstantial evidence. But it's led to, actually, I'll come back to that in a minute. I was going to show you something else. But so how do we make sense of all this? So I intentionally picked two complex-looking graphs here because this is what BCG does on the left, and this is what COVID-19 does on the right. So, where's the problem? Why can't we just mix these? And of course, it's very complicated, and we don't really know how one interacts with the other. But the recommendations that we made are, first of all, that non-muscle invasive bladder cancer itself, that diagnosis has no bearing on whether to vaccinate or not. So that just doesn't play into it. Patients are generally normal immune system. It's not an issue. We, of course, want to delay COVID-19 vaccination because it is so important to be protected. That ultimately is probably the biggest threat to the health of any one of us right now. In an ideal case, the patient would not get BCG for 2 weeks before or 2 weeks after the vaccine. And you could imagine, for example, if a patient is due for their next round of maintenance therapy, next week, but they could also get their vaccine next week. Well, let's just give the vaccine and delay the maintenance therapy by a month. That, won't be, or not even a month, 2 weeks, that won't be an issue. However, if you had a patient who was just getting started with induction therapy, it had a couple of doses of induction, you would not necessarily want to interrupt for 2 weeks on both sides of the vaccine. That would severely disrupt the schedule. And as the bottom point says, so minor delays in maintenance are not an issue, but delaying induction is something we want to avoid. And so ultimately, if you had a patient who's receiving induction therapy, so new diagnosis, high risk non-muscle invasive bladder cancer, getting BCG, let's say they've had 3 doses, they're able to get the vaccine. Well, they should get the vaccine. They should just have a 48-hour period before and after the vaccine where they do not get BCG. And that everybody was in agreement that that is likely, or that will be safe, and that it will not impact the efficacy of either the vaccine or the BCG. If a patient is about to start, it would make sense to delay the start by a week to get the vaccine now, and then do the second dose of the vaccine a week after the last dose. So the interval between 2 doses would be a little bit extended, but not likely to be relevant. And then this is what I thought I had before, but I moved it. There's a document. This is from August 2020, and it's a national body that does. I'm blanking on the term. They do health technology assessments, and for whatever reason, they've put together this great document that lists all the ongoing trials that are testing the use of BCG vaccine, so again, into the skin to protect against COVID-19 infection. And there are 20 trials in this document, all over the world as listed here. Thousands of patients, this is a 10,000 patient trial. 20 trials. Interesting one here at the top of this second page is Alex Lotta in Toronto has also initiated one with a recombinant BCG, this VPM1002, that has been genetically engineered to make it a more effective vaccine, and it's being tested anyway as a regular vaccine for tuberculosis. It's also being tested as a treatment for bladder cancer, and here he and the group are testing it to protect against COVID. So I mentioned this mainly as interest. This is not really related to who can get BCG or not, but it is interesting just to highlight that we think that BCG itself is actually protective. So just a short little segment on systemic therapy. So systemic therapy, here we're talking about chemotherapy. So it can be chemotherapy before bladder removal, after bladder removal, for metastatic bladder cancer, the different scenarios, not necessarily into the bladder. I think that is some to BCG, but even less of an issue. And immunotherapy, of course, the different drugs like pembrolizumab that are being used in advanced bladder cancer, and also in trials. There are a lot of patients on trials getting these drugs, even in early bladder cancer. And then erdafitinib is also used in a small proportion of patients, and these all have potential interactions with the immune system. But ultimately, for lack of knowing any better, they're typically treated the same with respect to vaccination. So some, again, just general background in cancer patients. A cancer patient, it can mean very different things. So I think of patients with non-muscle invasive bladder cancer as not really a cancer patient, like a patient who has a metastatic cancer of some sort. There's a huge world of difference there. And so if a patient has metastatic melanoma or metastatic bladder cancer, of course, they do have a higher risk of death from COVID-19 than the general population. I don't think that would be true of a patient with non-muscle invasive bladder cancer. These patients were typically excluded from the trials with the vaccine, so we don't really know how they work. Although the Pfizer trial did have approximately 4%. That's cited in a lot of places, but nobody ever tells us how the vaccine worked in those 4%, so it doesn't really mean very much. And if you look at the plan to roll out the vaccine, the I don't know if the dates are still valid the way things are going, but uh, extremely vulnerable patients are prioritized in BC with the plan to start vaccinating these patients in April. And this includes patients with cancers who are undergoing chemotherapy or other cancer treatments that affect the immune system. So that would be obviously immunotherapy and also the FGFR targeted therapy. And there's similar plans in other countries as well that cancer patients are actually being prioritized because they're deemed to be at higher risk. So it's not like we're avoiding a vaccine because a patient has cancer and is getting these treatments. We're actually prioritizing, which speaks to the safety of it. And these are some statements taken out of the BC Cancer document. I'm not going to read them to you. I'm happy to circulate the slides after if you like. But the first point just makes the case that it's just RNA. There's no live virus or attenuated virus, and this is safe even for the most immune compromised patient. However, the patient with cancer may have a diminished immune response, so that the vaccine might not work as well. And that's what you worry about. You don't want to have a vaccine and then assume that you're safe, and then it didn't work well, and then you're actually susceptible to infection. You would like to time it in such a way that you get maximal efficacy from it. And so that's a consideration. That's a very nuanced consideration. And then the bottom point is, of course, it's always up to the patient and the patient's treating physician to make the decision, because there are a lot of nuances for any given patient that aren't covered by general guidelines. And so if we try and piece together the different risks that a patient may face, trying to balance risk and benefit, there's the risk of infection from COVID-19, which may be dependent also on where you are. I mean, if you're in New Zealand, you're not worrying about it so much as if you're in London, and the variants that are around you and all that kind of thing make such a difference in the consideration of where your personal risk is. Then there's, of course, specific to cancer patients, what is the risk of delaying active treatment for the sake of vaccination if you were considering doing that? And then, as I touched on, what is the risk of suboptimal immunity because the patient was immune suppressed when the vaccination was given and did not have the maximum benefit from it? And so these are complex issues that ultimately go back to the patient and the treating physician. And so in conclusion, I think we can be very happy that we have two really effective vaccines on the market in Canada that are also very safe. There are some side effects, sort of flu-like side effects, aches and pains that go along with the mechanism of the vaccine, but nothing threatening at all. Ideally, we would have a 2-week gap on each side of any treatment, BCG, chemo, immunotherapy, but it's not necessary if treatment cannot be delayed. You still want to get your COVID-19 vaccine. Recognizing that the evidence to guide practice is limited and that these recommendations might change over the next few months. And again, the final verdict should come in a conversation between yourself and the physician looking after you.